So today we're going to be going over how to generate GUIs for the OMAP-L138 Experimenter kit in the modern day. We're going to be using Code Composer Studio as well as GUI Composer. The current issue in the modern day is that the current versions of Code Composer, which at the time of this recording is version 12, as well as GUI Composer, which is migrating towards version 3, no longer have support for this board. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back in time software-wise and use some old versions of the software. And we're going to be going over how to do that. So a couple things to make note. First off, this was prepared fairly quickly after I figured out how to do this. So there might be a better or more optimum way to go about it. Which if that's the case and you find one that's awesome, please share that with your peers or in the comments below. As well as a couple assumptions. First off, we're going to be using a Windows computer for this. As well as we're going to be doing this on the Logic PD Zoom OMAP-L138 Experimenter kit for DSP applications. We're also assuming that you have Code Composer Studio version 12 downloaded and set up and working fine to build and compile a code for our applicable kit. There's two ways we can go about doing this. The first one is going to be using Code Composer version 6.1.2 for everything. So it's going to be a one-stop shop for everything we're doing, but it means we have to use an older piece of software. The other method is to use 6.1.2 for GUI Composer only, but keep editing our code in Code Composer 12 or whatever the current version we are using is. While we are able to use our IDE that we're familiar with for coding, it does mean we need additional pieces of software to run GUIs. Picking which one you want to use really is personal preference. I'm leaning more towards sticking with 6 for everything just because we don't need to have several things running at one time. First demo is going to be utilizing Code Composer 6 for everything, which first off means we need to install it. So I'm going to download the installer from the website and unpack it from the zipped file, and now I'm going to launch it. The first two things that will appear are some pop-ups alerting me that I have my antivirus running in the background. You can go ahead and dismiss both of those. At least from my experience, it worked fine with those running. You can turn yours off and continue on if it presents to be an issue. Next what will appear is the license agreement. You can go ahead and select the terms. Then the install path will be prompted. I suggest leaving it default. If you do change it, make sure you remember where that is, as we will need to go there later. In processor support, you're going to want to select which processors you want to have supported. For us, I'm going to choose the C6000 single core device support, as well as the TI C6000 compiler. And that's what will work to get these OMAP DSP boards programmed. I'm going to let the default debug pro be selected, but I'm going to make sure to select GUI Composer in the next App Center page, and that is what will download GUI Composer. At this time, the install process is going to start, and it's going to take a minute, so we will return once Code Composer 6 is all installed and we have it launched. With Code Composer 6 now installed, we're going to load up some demo code and write an associated GUI and test it all out. So we have some sample code from the book Real-Time Digital Signal Processing, published in 2011. What this is serving is just an audio pass-through, so whatever comes in our input will be fed right through our output. In our interrupt service handler, though, we have two variables that will be serving us for our application. One's called audio gain and one is called last press. That audio gain is going to be tracked or edited by our volume slider, and last press will track the buttons that are pressed in our GUI. To launch GUI Composer, what you're going to want to do is go in the upper left on the toolbar, press View, and then GUI Composer, and this will launch GUI Composer within Code Composer 6. To expand it, we can double click on the tab and it will fill GUI Composer to our window. While it loads, if it's your first time, you get a splash screen. I have already tried something out here, so I already have one open. If you want to create a new project, you can click in the button next to the drop-down, enter your project name, and once you enter your project name, you can either do a blank project or use a project template. I recommend using a project template. For this one, we are using the simple project template. Once you press OK, it will start loading the new project. In terms of the UI of GUI Composer, in the center is your workspace, which will show the GUI that you're editing. On the left is your palettes, where you can have all the different elements you want to add or remove from your GUI. as well as your outline for your GUI, as this is instructed using HTML and CSS, so you can kind of see behind the front, as well as any variables you'll add, but we won't be covering that today. Below that is our project explorer. You can see those CSS files, HTML, as well as JavaScript files. On the right is your properties menu. Depending on the widget you have selected, you can edit some of the properties, such as what's it called, what's it's bound to, but we will go over that once we start adding elements. Above that, you can see the source code, or switch back to the design option, which is what your GUI will render as. And lastly, there's the ability to preview your GUI if you want to see what it'll look like and possibly function without having to go through the complex build process shown later. We can exit through our preview and then we can start adding some elements. I'm going to add a vertical slider to serve as our volume slider. I'm also going to add a button which will serve as a bit of a display to read out the value of that slider. Next, I'm going to add some value buttons, and this is what will be serving as our keyboard and what that last pressed variable will be written to. And I'm going to add one more normal button to serve as the display for that. I'm going to adjust my window here a bit, and I'm going to add a digital gauge. This will read out the value of our volume later on. And I'll just remove that text. So now that we have all our elements placed, we can organize it, clicking and dragging to create a selection window, make it look however we want. Next, we're going to select, go back into our ISR, find the variable we want to write to, in this case, audio gain. I'm just going to copy that to my clipboard, and then go into my volume slider, making sure to select the whole thing. On the right is various options. In widget, where you can set the minimum, maximum, your step size. In this case, by default, it's infinity. I don't really want any infinite resolution. I'm gonna change that to be 10 steps from 1 to infinity, or from 0 to infinity. I can also give it a name, which is for if you are editing more of the HTML, which is a different topic. But more importantly, in binding is where I will bind it to our audio gain variable. I recommend hovering over the tooltips or the names of all these parameters, and the tooltips will give you some helpful hints on what they are. So I've pasted the audio gain into that value, so now whatever the value of the slider is, that will be written to my variable. This button here, I can bind the label to a variable as well, so it will update as that variable is changed. So again, in binding, I'll go to label. I will then paste in the audio gain variable name. And then what will be displayed on that button is the value of that variable. Similar process for our digital gauge. I will paste in the name of our variable into the value field under binding. Under widget, I can select my min and max values, but for here I'm just going to turn on the LCD so you also get a discrete value. Next up, I'm going to edit my buttons. I'm going to copy the last pressed variable name, as we're going to now start binding to that one. Our first value button, we will bind the value to our last pressed variable. And in our widget, we are also going to edit the value there. Now these are two different values. It might get a little bit confusing, but in the widget panel, the value is what will be written to our variable that is bound. I'm also going to edit my label to represent that it's going to write a 1 to our variable. And I'm going to do the same thing for another button, this time for a value of 2. Once that's bound to my variable as well, I'm going to set up that last button to kind of serve as that same display where the label is bound to the last pressed variable name. I'm going to go ahead and adjust a couple things. That title text, I'm going to center it, maybe give it a better name than the default one. I'm going to center it. There's a lot of different parameters you can change using GUI Composer tied to the HTML elements. For here, I'm just going to change the font family to something a little bit better than the default Arial. Oh yeah, that looks a lot better. So now that I have my GUI created, I'm going to preview just to give it a quick look, see what it looks like. And I see my slider works, but nothing else works. They're not updating because we need to run the code at the same time. In order to do that, we need to export our project first. Before we can export, we need to build our code because we're going to need the binary files. So I'm going to press the build, and it's set up for debug build, which means if I go to my debug folder, I will see a file that ends in .out. I'm going to right-click on that, select the properties to see where it's located, and I'm just going to copy that file path. Once I've copied it, I'm going to go back into GUI Composer. In that Properties or File Explorer in the lower left, below the drop-down, there is a button to export the project. So I'm going to select that, and the first thing I'm going to choose is the location of where that project will be written to. So I'm going to go ahead in my File Explorer off screen, change my location for that. It can be wherever you want. In this case, I will be writing it to the workspace folder for Code Composer version 6. Also name it something applicable for the GUI. And press OK. Next, we have to select the type of device we're writing it for. For our Zoom kits, that will be the TMS320C6748, which is at the bottom of the list there. I will then select my connection as the V2 XDS V100 debug probe. And lastly, my program file is where I'm going to reference that .out file. So I'm going to go browse, and because we copied it to our clipboard, we can paste in the file path to the binary file right there. Last, I'll press OK, and this is going to create our GUI as a zipped folder inside our location, which in this case was the workspace folder. If we want to run that, however, we need to move that to a different folder. Wherever we installed Code Composer version 6, which by default is on our C drive in the TI folder, in the Code Composer V6 folder should be another folder called Web Apps. And that is going to be the home for all of our GUIs, because that is where Code Composer looks for them. If I double-click on the zip folder, we can drag it into the Web Apps folder, extracting it in the process. And now I can close out of both of these File Explorer windows. Going back to our code, I can now go ahead and debug it. And as the code is debugging, I'm going to set up a couple watch expressions here to track the audio gain variable as well as the last pressed variable within our debugger. So while we're changing it in our GUI, we should be able to see it change in the watch expression menu as well. Inside Code Composer, if I go to View, and underneath GUI Composer will be Applications, I can select whatever GUI I want to run, and it will launch it inside the debug menu. As you can see, we have all our elements here that we've added in our GUI. Now I'm going to show what it looks like when it doesn't work. When I press Stop, you can see all those red X's appear. So I pull up my debug menu again, all those red X's appear showing that it can't find essentially the variable that it's matched to. In this case, it says the index value is null. So that just means it can't find it. So typically either it means your code isn't running or something's wrong with your GUI binds. That's just an opportunity for you to go back and check your work. I'm going to go ahead and relaunch the code, and you can see everything works out. All those red X's are gone, and if I run it, and I edit if I drag my volume slider, we can see the button below it is updating, our watch expression is updating, but our digital gauge is not updating. After a little bit of debugging, All that was needed to make sure our digital gauge worked was to close the GUI and relaunch it again through the View menu. Next, I'm going to demonstrate how to utilize that GUI we just designed in Code Composer V6 and run it in Code Composer version 12 or any more up-to-date Code Composer instance. First, I'm going to launch version 12 and navigate to the App Center by going to the Help drop-down. Once it's opened up, I'm going to type in GUI Composer, and I'm going to select the GUI Composer runtime. This will allow us to run version 1 GUI Composer scripts, which is what we have just created. I'm going to go ahead and opt to install our software, agree to the license agreement, and then let the install process begin. This is of course going to take a minute, so we will return once it is done. While the runtime downloads, we're going to move our version 6 GUI into version 12. You can see in our web apps folder for version 6 we have the GUI there already. So in the version 12 install path, which by default is on our C drive, I'm going to make a web apps folder because one does not exist already. And then I'm going to open up that folder, and I can either just move or copy. I'm just going to insert my compiled GUI into that folder. In the background, GUI Runtime has already downloaded, and I've restarted GUI or CCS Composer. So I'm going to go ahead and debug my code, which this is a direct port of the same project we are using in version 6 of Code Composer. While that builds, I already have my watch expression set up for this demo, but I still need to launch my GUI. In order to do that, I'm going to go to the upper left in the toolbar where it says View. I'm going to click on that, hover over GUI Composer. And there's a couple different options. We want to select Applications of V1, which will be our version 1 GUIs we created in Code Composer version 6. I'll then select the GUI we want to run for this demo. And once it loads up, I will run our code. And I can click and drag the slider, and it's still incrementing at our number 10 step sizes. Our watch expression is updating accordingly. Our digital gauge and our button is updating. And once I press the buttons, those update as well. Well, that said, that concludes this demo on how to port over GUIs from version 6 to version 12.